Corey was the only one that messaged me. He's gonna be like 5 minutes late, but other than that, we should have all the finance committee members. Okay, and the link is in board docs. So whenever Ms. Brody, if you would like to start, we now have 3 board members. Oh, 4.
Is the link online to the video?
Yes, it is in board docs now.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'll just be off camera for a bit.
So
I need 1 second.
okay.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Good. So we're ready?
Yes, we're good to go.
Hello, good evening. This is the November 2025 finance meeting of the Hartford Board of Education. I'm the chair, Shante Brody, and I'm going to call the meeting to order. I want to remind us that with our questioning, we're going to ask a question when it's question time. Our CFO, Ms. Richard, will open up for questions at certain parts of the presentation. And we're going to allow 1 follow-up before we cycle to everyone and then return back to you if you have additional questions as board members. With that said, we're going to turn it over to our CFO, Ms. Caitlin Richard.
And I'm going to turn it over to our staff attorney, Ed Wilson, for the first piece on contracts.
And I do want to, so our first vice, Francois Gersto Ledger, she's going to help with the questions, if appropriate during the question time. She's going to chime in. Thank you.
So our first item is the Pullman and Comley contract request. This is a law firm that provides services to the school district. The deliverable here is to engage in this contract with Pullman and Comley, and that they provide advice regarding various labor and employment matters, including work beyond the scope of engagement, if precipitated by the issue of the day. It should also be noted that this is the law firm that the board has appointed, I think approximately about 3 years ago, that conducts student expulsion hearings. The contract amount is a total of $137,000 as allocated for $90,000 for legal and labor services. We'll unpack what that means on a future slide here, and then 47,000 allocated to the Office of School Leadership for the expulsion hearings. This is for this particular school year. And as I indicated, the departments are coming out of two departments, legal and labor services, as well as school leadership. This is strategically aligned to our operational and management excellence initiative. Now, in regards to some of the services provided by this law firm, they provide contract negotiations for us for approximately 10 of our bargaining units. This is the law firm that closed the SSO and paraprofessional negotiations last year. Currently, we're in active negotiations with our 566 group, and negotiations are approaching for our nurses, our subs, and our ECEs. And this is a law firm that historically has done those negotiations for the school district. This law firm also helps us with our Title IX training for our staff and our administrators, and provides general representation as needed. And in regards to the school leadership component, they conduct our expulsion hearings. We'll talk a bit about the numbers of those in future slides. Just by way of kind of history on this, as to why the board is seeing this now, the way the legal services are billed, like typically, you retain a law firm and it starts at zero and you're billed as the hours accrue for the services. Based on our projections for how we've utilized this law firm in the past, this is a PO request for approximately $90,000 for the labor and legal services side. And that amount was landed at to historically provide at well, the $40,000 previously budgeted for label services for this service has historically provided to be inadequate and necessitated, I apologize, budget amendments to me throughout the school year. So if we go to the next slide, what we've determined as over the course of these particular school years for fiscal year 2025, that was 72,000, 2468. The year before that was 131. In legal services, school leadership for the same timeframes for 2025, 28,000, 51 for 24, and 75,000 for 23. We give you the total fiscal years throughout those spent here. But if we just go back to the legal side, typically it's running, with the exception of the 2023, it's running under that $90,000 number. But based on kind of reviewing these numbers that we're averaging at, that's what's precipitated the ask at $90,000 for this contract on that legal side. And the 47 is essentially a median of the three numbers you see on the right side of the document of the 28,000, 51,000, and 75,000 as to how we landed at the numbers that are in front of the board for today's purposes. And in terms of the number of expulsions in the 2022-23 school year, it's about 75. Went to about 90 for the 23-24. back down to 75 for 24-25. And for this calendar school year, as of our current date, we're approximately about 17 expulsion hearings that have been conducted. And with that, I'll ask if the board has any questions.
Okay, I do see, and thank you so much for that that part of the presentation. And I do see that Board Member Walker has a question. So Board Member Walker, you have the floor for your question.
Yeah, thank you, Board Member Darcel Ledger. Yeah, Attorney, so what's not clear here is the scope of work, the scope of services being provided. I'd be more comfortable if the numbers came out of an anticipated scope of work that we anticipate doing. That kind of breakdown would be good. The history of the numbers, I get that you looked at trend data to come up with something that's to sanity check your numbers. But since you do, it sounds like almost like a time and materials type of contract. There's nothing that says that they won't blow past this number. So is there possible for us to get kind of a breakdown as to the kind of scope of work that they do and you know how we anticipate that this year? And then the second question with that is the expulsions. I didn't realize school expulsions come with a high-powered legal team. I thought expulsions were kind of just the district, well, telling a child that they're no longer coming to school until some situation changes or whatnot. What's that about too? What's the role that Pullman and Cumberland plays like in an expulsion hearing?
Great question. I'm happy to answer those questions. So expulsion, the process to expel a child is it requires the child have due process as articulated in our statute. What the statute actually provides is that the board can actually conduct expulsion hearings, or some component of the board can, but there has to be due process protections to that. Like, so they're almost like mini trials, for lack of a better way to explain it. With that said, either the board can conduct the hearings, or the board can hire an independent arbitrator to conduct the expulsion hearings. This board, I think approximately about 3 years ago, appointed Pullman and Connolly to conduct the expulsion hearing. So that was actually a product of something this board has done in appointing this law firm to conduct the expulsion hearings. And largely they serve as the hearing officer. Like, so this is now the independent arbitrator who hears the district side, as well as the student side, and arrives at a decision as to whether or not, per the statute, there's sufficient evidence to support the expulsion.
Yeah, Chair, if I may have a follow-up.
You may.
Attorney Wilson, that's great feedback on the expulsion piece. I guess what I'm just coming right back and asking you, as that's structured, is there a reason that our legal team couldn't play that role? It would seem to me totally appropriate to have someone who's currently in our employ, someone from your staff, play that role of impartial hearing officer. Is there a reason that can't happen?
Yeah, it can't happen statutorily. Statutorily, it would have to be some component of the actual board, meaning of the elected, the board appointed officials. So either some component of the board could do it, like 3 to 4 members of the board can conduct the hearing. If you just look at just kind of like taking a step back and talking about due process, what it needs to protect for is any like implicit bias in the process. So there needs to be someone that actually holds the district to account if the evidence doesn't support the need to expel a child. So that's why the way the statute reads is either the board does it or the board can appoint. This is so the language is that how we arrived here comes directly out of the Connecticut general statutes. So the board can do it, or the board appoints, and this board is the board 3 years ago took the option of appointing an independent lawyer to do it. So to answer your question, we could not do it that way.
Okay, I see. I see what you're saying. It has to be someone from the board, but I would ask that we.
Board Member Walker?
Yeah, do I not get it?
No. No,
Okay.
sorry.
All
But
right.
I thank you so much for your question
No,
and your follow-up question.
Well,
But-
put me back in queue. That's all.
I'll do that. Please put your hand down. But I will ask a question with regards to Attorney Wilson. Is it perhaps because we don't have the capacity to conduct these, these hearings, if you will, because there's a certain time frame that they have to be, there's a timeline where they have to be, done within a certain time. Is that correct?
Well, there is a time frame, and I guess that's the question. And I don't want to be rhetorical, but I guess that's the question that I guess the board would need to determine. But I could unpack the timeframes for you, because we could always revisit whether or not the board wants to do the expulsion hearings itself, or we want to continue to have an independent law firm do them. But just to kind of unpack, hey, Christina, could you go back to the expulsion slide, please? Just to unpack the way that works in real time. Typically, if a school district is moving towards expulsion, I would say probably 100% or 99% of these cases, the child is suspended for 10 days pending expulsion. So what that means is that ideally that hearing should occur within the 10 days, right? So if we're in a space where the board is saying, you know what, we're going to do these expulsion hearings. So for like any one of these particular school years, if we just kind of unpack the numbers, the board would be responsible for conducting a hearing, gathering some quorum of the board, and conducting a hearing within 10 days of the suspension date, and issuing a decision as to whether or not the student is going to be expelled. So the time frames, and these are quick turnaround hearings. So, so the question would be whether or not the board has the capacity and the time to devote to hearing those cases, which could be an hour, could be 2 hours, and then issuing a decision within the 10 days of any suspension.
Thank you so much. And one more question. Roughly, how much money could that save if the board decided to take on this role again?
On the expulsion side, so we've allocated 47,000, so that'd be about 47,000 per year.
All right. Thank you so much. And I'm looking to see if another board member perhaps has a question. And you may continue.
I could answer the part about the scope of services. I believe that was an outstanding question. The scope of services, what this firm helps us with largely is our negotiations and our arbitrations. So, and again, the volume of that would depend on kind of when we are in active negotiations, or how many active negotiations we are in at any particular school year. So that's why you would see some kind of fluctuation in price of services across years. There's some years where there's multiple negotiations. There's some years where that number could be quite low. And then depending on, how many cases end up going to arbitration. So the scope of services would be those large bucket items, arbitration, defense, and the negotiations.
Thank you, Attorney Wilson. That's one of the reasons I was asking you to do this budgeting in some ways based on your anticipated scope of services. Because I figured some of the fluctuation is, in essence, I'd expect you to say, hey, this is a light year. Here's why we have this number. This year, we're expecting an expanded scope of negotiations, and hence why we have a bigger number. Now, the only question to follow up on what Board Member Darcel Ledger said is, who can play this role? It sounds like the board could play that role in terms of at the hearing. What I'm wondering is, can we revisit who are the folks that can play that role? If not us, I'm wondering, are there other parties that we could bring in as a hearing officer that in essence would be cheaper than like $325 to $375 an hour? Would there be, you know, that person, does it have to be, you know, an attorney from, in essence, a prestigious law firm to just play that particular function? Could a non-attorney even play that function?
Well, the I have just a couple general thoughts. Oh, I'm sorry. Well, I have a couple general thoughts about that if you're posing the question to me. I would note that the first scenario, right? So the statute clearly says the board can do these hearings, right? So to your point, is it required that a lawyer do them? The answer would be no, right? The statute does envision that some component of the board can do it. I guess the second piece of that, I would just kind of note and flag that there are, you know, I don't want to overcomplicate it, but there are intricate details to due process that we want to make sure are protected in these hearings. So, you know, we can absolutely look if that's what the board's prerogative is as to whether or not there's services that could provide this that are not legal. I would just have a concern as to whether or not we're inviting, you know, unintended issues by going that route in situations where the record doesn't, you know, support the due process protections that we get when we're contracting with a lawyer to provide these services. One thing the board has to its advantage is you also have the benefit of corporation counsel that can advise you to make sure that we're within legal parameters if you were to conduct these hearings. So I just would kind of flag that. As to kind of one internal protection with the board doing these kind of hearings, as opposed to kind of like what we might encounter if it's just like a non-legal person doing the hearings.
So, well, I will end it. I hear you, Board Member Darrell Ledger. What I'm saying is that it's customary now that people go to mediation for all types of things, and so, you know, I'm just trying to figure out why this wouldn't fit in this category. There are enough legal people around this process to make sure the due process is followed.
This is not a mediation, though. That's the
well,
thing.
what I'm saying, that my point is, though, that that I'm saying that due process is just what is it's a due process. It's a set of rules being followed, and to assure that that happens is. I'm just questioning if Pullman and Connolly isn't really essential for that particular piece. What I'm hearing is Pullman and Connolly is just belts and suspenders, right? But we have corporate counsel and other people to make sure we don't make a mistake. Pullman and Connolly is not going to do that. They're not going to make sure we don't make a mistake. They're just going to play their role. So yeah, I'd like to visit to see can someone else to give us some more options in this one space.
Thank you for your comment, Board Member Walker. I see Board Member Fortune has her hand up. Board Member Fortune, you have the floor.
Sure, thank you. I guess first, Attorney Wilson, clarification. Is this something Corporation Counsel could do?
The answer would be no. They could advise the board. I mean, actually, to kind of unpack it more, Corporation Counsel, in situations where the family comes with a lawyer, Corporation Counsel actually represents us in front of the independent arbitrator, who would be Pullman and Connolly, and the adversarial, for lack of a better term, family would have a lawyer. So they're like mini trials, right? So Corporation Counsel cannot also be the independent hearing officer as well as represent the board in situations where the family is coming with a lawyer.
Okay, because I kind of suspected there would be some conflict there in some situations, which is essentially what you've confirmed. I worry that we're being penny wise and pound foolish here by nitpicking on this. If my child is potentially being expelled, I would want attorneys in that room on every single side, because this it's a huge decision to expel a child. And I would not want that taken lightly and try to cut corners because we're worried about that child getting a fair shake and a fair, their full due process. I think with everything that's going on, the last thing I want is for us to feel like the children who are potentially being expelled, which this is where we're trying to, save a few $1,000s, because that ultimately is not going to solve our budget issues. And we potentially risk opening up ourselves to more legal troubles by having people who are not fully qualified or people who just really have no business determining whether or not a child should be expelled. I would think anyone who's really qualified for such a weighty decision is not going to be $20 an hour or $50 an hour. That's just my 2 cents.
Thank you so much, Board Member Fortune. And I do not see any more hands. So Attorney Wilson, please continue. Thank you so much.
That concluded my presentation, but I'm happy to answer any other questions that the team has.
All right, I do not see any more hands up, so thank you so much for your presentation.
Thank you.
And Christina, can you please pull up, or is that the only agenda item?
That is, well, now we just move on to the
Okay.
to Ms. Richard, and she's
Okay,
Yes, now we will move on to our bigger budget woes. So
thank you.
I will share my screen. Oops, sorry. Okay, so today we have about an hour, so I'm going to try to keep us on track here. And some of the content is some of what we talked about last time, and then there's some new content. And so I'll try to emphasize the new pieces of this, and then we can follow up on anything we miss at the December Board Finance Committee meeting. But the goal today, we're going to start with the current fiscal year, so similar to last time, and then we'll talk about the budget development process for next year, as we're trying to get a head start on that. So when we're talking about the current year, this is a recap from what we talked about last time, but just wanted to emphasize a few points. Some of the trends that we're seeing. One is declining enrollment, and we're going to spend some time today looking at some data related to where students have gone over the past few years. So that will be a big piece for today. Also, our staffing rates have increased. So we shared this last time. We're very excited because our vacancy rate has decreased significantly. That also does come with budget impacts. And then finally, we'll touch on this briefly. It was also touched on in the special education update the other week. We are seeing higher needs of the special education students in the system, and so have added some paraprofessional allocations. So these are all the trends we're seeing in the current year that we know about right now that have a budget impact. And like I said, we're going to focus on this enrollment piece because the last time we talked about coming back with some more details on, for those students who left, where did they go? And we'll pause after the enrollment deep dive for questions. So this is a recap. We showed this last time, but really want to emphasize that the enrollment drop we see for this year, so down to about the 15,200 students, is more significant than any other year that we've seen. I also had the opportunity to go to a conference with other CFOs across large urban districts in the country, and everyone did experience enrollment decline, but not to this degree. And so, like we talked about last time, we had the hypothesis that some of this is something everyone's experiencing, probably related to immigration-related concerns. But part of this is probably unique to Hartford, especially with some of the school choice system. So that's what we're going to dive into now. And you can see here, these were some of our hypotheses. Part of it was the school choice system, part of it was immigration. And so we're going to dive into where students went. And I will apologize, I know we sent the deck Friday. It didn't have these slides. They are truly hot off the press. So the team has been working really hard to pull all the data from October 1st to see where students have gone, and actually did a historical analysis to see how that has changed over the past few years. So these are some of the new slides. And again, you'll have these all, and this can be the start of a conversation on this piece, and I will open it up for questions after the next few slides. So in terms of enrollment trends, what we looked at in this analysis was students who have left Hartford Public Schools in the past 4 years, so since the 2022 school year. What we see is there's 2 types of students who have left. One is students who are no longer residents of the city of Hartford. So we'll look at that first. Then there are students who are still residents of the city of Hartford, but they've chosen a different school choice option other than Hartford Public Schools. So we'll see in that first piece of students, families relocating outside of the city, there's a large movement to the suburbs, and we'll look at some of those numbers. And then you'll see among school choice, there's a few different options. So magnet schools, open choice, with magnet schools being the most popular. And I want us all to keep in mind that this is part of the Sheff settlement in 2022, was that there would be at minimum 2,700 about new seats added for Hartford students to attend magnet schools and open choice schools. And as of this year, there was about 1,600 seats added. So we know that going on in the space, there have been additional seats added specifically for Hartford resident students, and we'll look at some of the data to see how many students are engaging in that process. When we first look at, so these are students who are no longer residents of Hartford. So that's about 5,000 of the students who have exited. There is another part of this equation that is students that have entered, but what we're focusing on today is students who have left, so we can really identify those trends. And what you can see, most of those students and their families have moved to a different town or district. So some of the most popular ones were New Britain, East Hartford, Manchester, West Hartford. So just simply students have moved to a different area. And so that's really a conversation for us to be having at the level of the city of what it looks like to attract families to the city in general, what housing options look like, etc. Also, some students and their families moved to other states, and some did move to other countries. So this is just looking at any students who's left in the past 4 years. If we know where they have gone, which is quite a few of them, we know that most of them have gone to other surrounding districts. So they're in the Hartford area, but not living in Hartford anymore. Now I'm going to turn to students who still live in Hartford, but they have made different school choice decisions than attending HPS. So these were students that were attending Hartford Public Schools, and at some point in the past 4 years, they made the decision for another school choice operator. So you see the total there is about 2,271 students over the past 4 years made the choice to leave Hartford Public Schools and attend a different option. And then you can see on the right is just the total number of students enrolled, Hartford resident students enrolled in each of these options. So the way to read this is that for magnet schools, which mostly are CREC, 1,141 students left Hartford Public Schools for CREC in the past 4 years, and the total number of Hartford resident students in CREC is 5,151 as of this October 1st. And that you can read for each of these categories, so CT Tech, open choice, charter schools, and private schools. So you can see CREC and magnet schools in general are the biggest category of enrollment for students who leave the district, and this has increased over the past few years, followed by open choice schools and then charter schools. And the last slide I'll show you, and then we will pause for questions or wonderings you have or other data we want to look at. This is looking over the past 4 years, so it's saying for 2022, 2023, 2024, and then the current year, this is fall 2025, how many students left and for which options. And so what you can see is in 2022, the numbers are pretty small and they increase every year thereafter, specifically for magnet, which specifically is for CREC and Goodwin. And when you pair that up with the knowledge that the Sheff CCP is opening additional seats, again, about 1,600 seats have been open since 2022, you see that there is this trend over time of an increasing number of students leaving, particularly for those magnet options. So I will pause there. I know that was a lot of data, and open it up for, questions, wonderings, other types of data you'd like to look at.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for that presentation. So I have before I turn it over to Board Member Walker, who has his hand up, I have a question with regards to the data that you shared of students leaving. Are you able to break that down by whether it's high school, middle school, lower, I don't say lower elementary, but like preschool, kindergarten, like that. Do you have that data available?
Yes, we should be able to do that. And the other thing we want to do, and we can bring this to the December meeting, is look at what zones they're leaving from, so we can have a sense of which of our schools that they're leaving. So yes, we can look at grade levels, maybe some other demographics, and also where they reside within Hartford and what schools they might have been going to.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. And are you also able to see if some of these children, or if some of these students have left as a result of parents perhaps working in a different school district, and they're taking their child with them? Are you able to see any of that, or does that, because that does happen? Because I'll put my hand up. My virtual hand, I did that, but I brought my child back as my child got older. So I'm just curious, because I'd like to know if you have that data. Are you able to track that?
It's a good question. My guess is it's not tracked in the quantitative data, but I'll talk with our data team.
Okay, all right, thank you so much. And now I will turn it over to Board Member Walker. You have a question?
Yeah, thank you, Board Member Darcel Ledger. Yeah, a comment and question. One, fantastic breakdown. It answers a couple questions. One, your data seems to confirm that in terms of who we can invite back to the city, the universe we have to select from really is that 2270 or that number,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
So at least we can comfort ourselves in understanding that 5,000 plus people have just left Hartford, and those fit us out of Hartford at this point. Now, two things. One, I was thinking they've deployed all the seats. You seem to give it, your presentation gives the indication that we should expect the state to open up on another 1,100 seats in the upcoming year or two.
That's my understanding, is that the settlement in 2022 goes through, I think it's a 10-year settlement. And so they have targets over the course of the years for how many additional seats would be opened. And I do believe, yeah, about 1,100 additional seats are meant to be added between now and the 29 school year.
So if I can follow up quickly, I would recommend if you can find and present to us that timeline so we can maybe see the stair step of when that's coming. And so, for planning purposes.
Yes.
There was a second, I wanted to understand, you had that slide where you had the 2270 and then you had the 9,500. Okay. I totally get the 2,700 is the breakdown of 2270. I'm sorry. That's our students right now. That's our breakdown of where they're going. Is that 9929 the total number of students in these buckets, or are those former Hartford people?
Yes, so good question. So that right column, so the 9,929 is the number of Hartford resident students who have chosen other school operators, just in total. And then the breakdown below that is, so essentially at magnet schools, there's 5,151 Hartford resident students who attend them. The number on the left is just how many of those students left in the last 4 years. And so it's just isolating some of the trends. So of the 929 Hartford resident students not attending Hartford Public Schools, 2,271 of them left in the last 4 years.
So, okay. So it changes my headset. So now in terms of what the superintendent was talking about, inviting people back, that 9,900, those people we could target to try to pull back into the district.
Yes, that's the total number. Exactly. Yes.
Okay. So there is a big runway of people we could in essence try to entice to return to Hartford. Okay.
Yes. Yep.
Okay. Then that's really good data. I'll end with this. Our students who go to the Hartford magnets are still considered Hartford students. So I just want to separate that. Occasionally people get confused between Hartford magnets and the correct magnets.
Correct.
So Harvard magnets
those
are not
students are
included.
counted as going to Hartford Public Schools.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much. And I don't see any more hands up, so thank you for that portion.
Okay, we will keep moving. So a couple more slides about data about this current year, and then we're going to move to the budget process for next year. So another request we had last time was about current class sizes. So we talked in October about how we were doing the class size adjustment process. And because we have much lower enrollment than anticipated this year, that's enabling us to have some smaller class sizes for this year. And so what you're seeing on this slide is by groups of grade levels, what the current average class size is compared to what the maximum or staffing ratio is. So the main takeaway from looking at the class size data is class sizes are smaller currently, pretty significantly so compared to the maximum. And again, that's because we staffed at our projected enrollment and then we experienced that unanticipated enrollment decline. So currently pre-K classes are an average of 16 students, K-2 classes are 17 students, grades 3 to 5 are 20 students, and 6 to 12 are about 17 students. And these are, again, below the maximums or how we staff. And so this was just a question from last time of what do class sizes currently look like? And then we'll talk about for the budget process for next year, what it means in terms of our enrollment projection and our staffing ratios, et cetera. The one other piece about this year I wanted to touch on was the special education para-educators. And some of this was referenced at the special education workshop meeting that occurred recently, but just wanted to name that, you know, we staffed a certain number of para-educators, 383, and then the team did a thorough review of the needs of students based on their IEPs. Including new students who have registered in the district, and determined we needed 60 more para-educators after going through that review, after seeing, you know, areas where it may not be needed. And so the reason we're talking about it here is I just want to name there is a budget implication of that we want to be clear about. It is mandated based on IEPs. And importantly, it will add to this year, and then we will need to factor it into next year's budget so we can be more proactive about it, knowing this likely is the true number of para-educators that we need. Which will come with an associated trade-off. So those are the takeaways from this year. Next steps in terms of mitigating the deficit we have for this year, we've been working really closely with the city finance team, have been in communication with them about these trends. We're going to monitor any of our non-salary expenses, so we'll have more data come January about things like tuition and transportation. We're doing a thorough look at any mid-year hires, just to make sure they make sense in the context of the level of staffing and students that we have. And then, like I mentioned, all of this, the part of the reason we're talking about the current year is it will help us plan for next year. So now we'll have a better sense of what we're facing in terms of enrollment, vacancy, what we need for special education paras for next year. So that's the conclusion of this year. We're going to turn to next year, but I'll pause just briefly if there's any questions about anything I just said before we move to next year.
I do not see any hands up, so please continue.
Okay, thank you. So now we're turning to planning for next year. Again, some of this we looked at last time, but this slide is the summary of where we stand currently. So overall, we face a structural deficit. This means if something structural doesn't change, we are going to continue to face a deficit. We talked a bit last time about the current projection is around 35 million. We are going to be refining this up until about January to make sure we have all of the right inputs like tuition and transportation, but it's only projected to increase moving into the future. And the main driver of this, and this is part of what we looked at last time, is the difference in revenue and expense for Hartford resident students who don't attend Hartford Public Schools. So that's why it's so important for us to understand that enrollment information, because so much of what is shaping our fiscal reality is how the school choice system is funded and how special education intersects with that. And so changing how this is funded is truly the single biggest lever we could be focused on. And that will require state level action, state level advocacy. It's something we've started to talk about in a lot of different spaces. And so just want to emphasize that when we think about our structural deficit, that state level piece is really the biggest component of it. There are things in our locus of control that we can do to enhance the student experience, attract students back to the district, create financial efficiencies, but they do have smaller overall financial impacts. And so I know there's been a lot of talk on our school portfolio, by which I mean the number of schools that we have, if we should close schools. And just want to say here that one, we will be doing a feasibility study, and we'll talk about that in a little bit, because it's always important to understand your portfolio of schools. We want to center the student experience. So it should be about how do we create the best possible experiences for our students. And it's just not something that saves a lot of money. And so it saves maybe $1 million per school at most. And so I think we need to separate it from the conversation about how we solve the structural deficit and instead talk about how do we provide the best experiences for our students. Similarly, something else within our locus of control is doing more in-house special education programming. The team has really been thinking about that. There's funding available for it next year. So that's another thing that we can do to attract more students back. But I think the main takeaway, and we'll go over some slides that cover some of these points, is that we face a structural problem. We have to think about the school choice system at the state level and how it is funded. And there are also some things that we can do, but they're just a smaller financial impact. We talked about this slide the last time, but really we're trying to cover all this territory in the process. So we're collecting data, so that's why we've been looking at things like our enrollment, our staffing rates, etc. We then need to think about structural change, so how we're doing our legislative advocacy and what precisely we want to target that will have the biggest impact for us as a school district. We're thinking about how we make decisions that are good for students and increase efficiency, so we'll talk about some of that, and how we're engaging the community alongside all of that. This is a draft budget timeline, just showing the plan for the next few months. And really a goal has been starting this conversation earlier. So that's why we started talking at the last meeting about the budget process for next year. And really what you can see is there's a lot of inputs that go into the budget process that we're talking about right now. So things like understanding our enrollment, understanding our financials from last year. We talked a bit about the performance data at last week's workshop to understand what our outcomes are. And then at the December workshop, there'll be an overview of the strategic plan. And what that allows us to do is when we get into the process in January and February, to have a conversation around how are we best aligning our resources to our strategy. And in January, we're going to get a lot more data. So we'll have mid-year enrollment to see if anything has changed. We'll also have a better estimate of tuition. So it takes time to do the whole process with other school choice operators over the tuition payments, especially special education tuition can fluctuate. So we'll have a better sense then, which means in January, we'll have a more precise deficit estimate. And then we can start having conversations with schools about their staffing allocations with central office, etc. That's all leading up to a goal of us doing our vote in April around the budget. City Council then votes in May, and then June is when the state legislative session ends. So that's an overall similar set of milestones to last year. And what I put it in italics here, something we talked about in the process last year was going earlier to the city with a list of prioritized items to say, hey, these are some of the things that currently we can't fund in our budget. They are really important to our strategic plan, to our students. We want to make a formal request for funding. And so I put that in here as a goal for us to put something together earlier in the process so it can flow into the city's budget process. But did want to name that. We could definitely talk about that because that would be a shift from last year. But I think us starting this conversation now will help us to say, if we don't get any more money in X, Y, and Z ways, these are the pieces we can afford that we would ask for additional funding from the city for. So that's the overall draft timeline. We have our board finance committee meetings all throughout this. We want to be engaging the community throughout this and are going to start doing very similar discussions to what we're having right now with almost every stakeholder group in the next couple of months. And then the state legislative session will start, I believe, in January and go throughout the spring. And so that's the other place that we're going to want to be plugging in to advocate for the pieces that will have the biggest impact for us. This is just a reminder when it comes to the numbers of what we are facing. Oops. This is the projected deficit as of right now. It's assuming essentially flat or actually decreased funding in certain areas. and that our expenditures trend in a way similar both historically, but also to the data we already have from this year. So we talked about this a bit last time. You see that gap, it's about 35 million right now, and only increases in the out years. And this was part of the conversation that we had at MARB, which is the state level accountability board, of essentially this is the structural problem that we're facing. And we also talked a bit about this slide that was, let's just look at this for Hartford resident students not attending Hartford public schools, of which we now know there's about 9,000 of them. And the difference between that is really explaining a lot of the deficit. So you see that that deficit is about 35 million for next year. And when you look at FY27 on this slide, it's about 37 million. So it's really explaining a lot of the challenge that we're facing, is that difference between the money we get in and then the money we spend for the students who don't attend our schools. I think I'm gonna pause right there, and then we'll have a few more slides after that. But I'm gonna pause there for just any questions, thoughts on what we just talked about.
Thank you so much. That's something. So if you can just please just give us just a recap really quickly of roughly how much money it would save if we actually did close a school.
So closing a school, so based on the last time that Hartford closed schools and just an analysis at looking other districts nationwide, it's about $1 million you might save. And I think this is the part that I want to help people understand, is that I think sometimes people think if we close a school, everything we're spending on that school goes away. And really what happens is, say you have 3 third grades at one school, 3 third grades at another, those students all go somewhere. So if they go to the other school, maybe you'd have a total of 5 third grade classrooms. You might have 6 though still. And so you're actually not saving much in terms of the staffing, because those students have to go to another school and the teachers have to go with them as well. You would save on the principal for that school, the assistant principal, kind of numbers like that are positions that are really one per school. And then the actual other piece of this, because part of the work I did when I was in Tulsa was around closing schools, it's the unintended costs of sometimes your transportation costs increase. And also that building, if you can't sell it and you're still maintaining it, you're still paying a lot of the maintenance and utilities costs for it. So that's a bit of a breakdown. It's essentially you can save on some parts of what you were staffing that school with, but a lot of the staff are going to go to a different school, and you do have to pay increased transportation and cost to maintain that building if you don't sell it.
Thank you so much. And the other question that I had was, when these students say they decide that it's not working out at a magnet school and they want to come back, the money does not follow them, correct?
So that's complicated, because we essentially, the way that would work is that, because we're receiving funding if they're a resident of Hartford, so we're getting the per pupil from the state. If they then attended a magnet school, so if they went to CREC, we would pay tuition to CREC for that student. We'd pay general education tuition and then any special ed expenses. So if that student came back, we likely would then not pay tuition, or we would prorate it for the amount of time they were actually at that school. And so it's slightly complex, because we got the revenue for that student, but then we paid tuition. But if it's mid-year, then we would likely prorate it so that we're not continuing to pay for the student if they are actually back in our school.
All right, thank you so much. And I do see Board Member Fortune, your hand is up. You have the floor.
Thank you. Knowing the structural issues that we face, and I know this is not new to us, we've discussed this at least, several times since I've been on the board. How do we ensure that we are incorporating this and discussing this with, if we're still going to use the same lobbyists, who can really make sure that this is being communicated to our legislators and that we can advocate in a way that can address that structural issue? Because ultimately just giving us some money now doesn't solve this, and just closing schools doesn't solve this.
Yes.
How do we advocate and push for changes that will actually address this underlying issue If does it mean we need to take, who else should we be bringing into this conversation? Because I think this is powerful information to have, but how do we act on it to actually get results?
I think it's a great question. I will say I know, and I don't know if someone else wants to jump in, but we are going to be starting the Legislative Advocacy Committee again, where I think the idea is going to be, can we get super precise on what we need to bring to the legislature and in all the spaces we're in with the state, because there's a variety of them. But I don't know if, Christina, if you would add to that.
Yep. We actually just finished our pre-meeting with the lobbyists. Ms. Krista Estrada Perez is going to take on this committee. We're going to reconvene very soon, and this is top priority funding. So rest assured, it's going to be one of the top topics, funding and the funding models. So yes, look out for it. We're going to start this as usual with the parent groups, with the teachers groups, and everyone, with the Legislative and Advocacy Task Force. I don't know if that answers your question, Ms. Fortune. And
Yeah, I think that's heading in the right direction. I just, I feel like last time, I wrote some letters to the legislature, and it was, most of them were in bills that really had no chances. I would like us to spend the efforts where we know we have a real chance of getting some type of positive and favorable outcome, and just being smarter about where we deploy our people and our resources and our efforts. But I think
Agreed.
Board Member Estrada Perez is well positioned to be able to help us with
She
that,
is.
along with whoever else we bring on board. And if our lobbyists are the right people, or do we need a different group? Like, those are all things I think we ought to be considering.
Got it.
Thank you, Board Member Fortune, and I see Board Member Walker has his hand up. You have the floor.
Yeah, thank you, Board Member Darcy Ledger. So a couple questions about the slide that we're currently on. CFO Richard, legislatively, I thought last year we were talking about, or some proposal to change the excess cost factor from that 4.5 to something lower. The fact you have a flat funded would give me the feeling that didn't happen, and we don't anticipate what. So I'm asking, how did that get constructed? And I'm also seeing the ECS, which also was, I thought it's supposed to be more dynamic, also seems flat. So is this because both of those legislative things just failed last year? Is that what you're trying to show here? Because if it is, I'm going to recommend that these are the things we should legislatively try to bring back up again this year, because it made sense last year to try to fix these.
Yeah, so I can speak to that. And it would help to start with a recap of what did happen last year. And so I can share a bit of that, because last year was really focused on special education. One thing that did happen was they increased the amount of money statewide for the excess cost grant, but that was only $1 million more for Hartford Public Schools. So I think they put like $30 million more in the statewide fund. So we went from 11 something to 12 something, but there's no plan to increase that further. So at this point, that is flat. And to your point, the 4.5 you referenced, just for the viewing public, is we only get reimbursed for costs that exceed 4.5 times our average per pupil. So if our average per pupil is $20,000, we only get reimbursed from the state if a student is costing more than $90,000. So anything above that. And then the state doesn't fund that grant fully. So they're only funding it at a certain percentage. So there was a little movement on that, but again, $1 million in the grand scheme isn't getting at the structural issue. The other thing that happened on special education was the new SEED funding is what they're calling it. And so that was a grant that was going to be the equivalent of a weight for special education students in the funding formula, but it's only partially funded. So we got about $3 million from that's going into the budget. So there's that one also includes rate setting. And so I did get an update the other day that over the next 3 years, the state is going to be working on setting rates for special education providers to say this type of service costs this much to make it more consistent. So that is exciting and promising, but it will take probably 3 years to see that. And what we'll see, ideally, what that would turn into is lower tuition expenses or more consistent tuition expenses. Because what you can see on this slide is tuition just skyrockets over time based on what we've seen in the past several years. And then on ECS, the thing that did happen with ECS funding is that they finally phased in the funding. So it's fully funded now, is what they're calling it, the full formula. This is just showing the ECS for the students who are residents of Hartford. So it doesn't shift really, because this is just per student who decides to leave Hartford Public Schools, what is the amount attributed to them. And so it's that piece plus the city's contribution to ECS. So I'd say overall, that's kind of a summary of what happened last year. And we had some wins last year in terms of some more funding for special education, full funding of ECS, but this is still the reality even with it. And so something bigger would need to change. And to your point, we should figure out what we want to target to actually see something shift about the difference in these numbers over the next several years. Oh, I think you're muted, Board Member Walker, if you're talking.
I think one follow-up is the tuition line. Is that line reflecting the rate of increase in tuition, or are you baking in more students are going to be entering that line in those out years?
It's a composite. So it's based on the historical average we've seen, weighting the past few years more heavily. So like we saw, more students are leaving, and the per pupil cost of special education tuition has been increasing. So it's an 8% increase every year that captures both of those dynamics.
Thank you.
Thank you, Board Member Walker. And I do not see any more hands up, so please continue.
Okay, this will be the last section. And so definitely a takeaway from what we just talked about is legislative advocacy and us getting very precise about what we are advocating for. This next piece we're going to talk about is a bit more about some things within our locus of control that we should start talking about as potential changes for the upcoming school year, of things that could actually benefit students, increase efficiency, etc. I just wanted to put this slide up because this is our current budget, and these are some of the categories we talked about last year, where we have fixed expenses is about 38% of our budget. So that's tuition, transportation, utilities. And that's what we were just talking about. 38% of the budget being fixed is what makes it really difficult for us to be able to make decisions. And so that's where the legislative advocacy needs to happen. The rest of our budget is predominantly straight to schools. So that's the school budgets are about half of our total budget. And then central office is the smaller piece, that's the rest of it. And so that's just grounding us in kind of overall in our budget right now, what do these categories look like? Knowing that fixed expense keeps increasing, and that's where we'll have to focus some of our advocacy. In terms of some strategic decisions we are starting to think about and that I want to start workshopping with all of you, we're trying to think about places that we can enhance our ability to serve students and be efficient with resources. And like I mentioned, could be a part of an ask to the city or the state to really ask for very specific things. We'll want to look at that from the lenses of, is it aligned to the strategic plan? What is the impact of this in terms of funding, or are there opportunities for funding for this? What is the impact on students and staff? What's the community saying? And then a timing piece. So when would this need to happen in the process to be able to implement it? So this is just the start of that discussion of starting to identify those areas of focus that we can talk about during this process. So what you'll see on this slide is some of the pieces that we've started to brainstorm, and we have talked about here a lot of these already, but just wanted to essentially start a list of the things that we should be exploring, and then hear from all of you if there's any other areas we should add. So one piece I will name is that we have the city funded items for this year, and so they don't have guaranteed funding for next year, and we'll review what those are on the next slide. But just want to name, we got some additional city funding for some specific things, and that funding as of now is slated to go away for next year. So we'll have to talk about those. Another piece is around high school scheduling and staffing. And so really looking into how do we make strategic, efficient, effective schedules at the secondary level, because it's very complicated staffing all different types of courses based on student requests, aligned with graduation requirements, and really leveraging staff effectively. And this includes both general education teachers, but also really thinking about how we leverage special education, multilingual learner teachers, student support staff. So thinking really holistically about how we're staffing schools, and especially at the high school level because schedules are so complicated, that's a kind of process or area that we want to focus on in the budget development for this year. Another idea is just the thought of sharing resources across co-located and nearby schools, so just having more partnership between those sites in terms of sharing resources, as we have several schools that are located physically in the same building. This we talked about was the school portfolio analysis, and so we are going out to RFP for that, and really it's focused on the student experience, what our current portfolio of schools, grade spans, feeder patterns, et cetera, allow us to do, and if there are any opportunities to offer more programming to students. And so the current state of that is we worked with the city, we added some kind of details formatting, and we'll be sending it back to them. We are going to be sending that out to all of you so you understand what's included in that. And as we're choosing an organization to do this study, but really it took all of your feedback about make this about the student experience, make it holistic. Let's look at everything, including enrollment, resourcing, staffing, facilities. So really just a comprehensive view that I think will give us a lot of data about the current state and some ideas that we can talk about for the future. The other piece, I briefly mentioned this, was special education, more in-house programming. So the idea is that for students that are being outplaced, can we actually retain them in our district? It's better for those kids, that they can stay close to home. We can offer programming here. And it is ultimately cheaper than paying tuition. And so there is some state grant funding we can apply for to kind of have the startup costs of that. And that's something the special education team is thinking about planning around. And then finally, as always, looking at centralized staff and contracts through the budget process to just understand which are the most important. And I will say part of the mayor's announcement in the budget process last year was just working with us to identify any potential shared services between the city and the Board of Education. So we talked about that a bit. Nothing has started on that front yet, but the idea would be another feasibility study to see if there's any back-end office type functions that we could be more collaborative with them around. One, to offer better service, and two, if there is any cost savings there. So this is the current list. We've talked about a lot of them. Some of them might be slightly new. And then the last piece would just be anything we identify that feels like a need based on the strategic plan or kind of to enhance the experience. So leaving that part open. But I will pause there because this is a place, if there's any questions about what I said or input about other areas we should be exploring or focusing on in this process.
Okay. Thank you. Let me see. Okay, Board Member Walker, your hand is up.
Yeah, thank you, Board Member Darrell Ledger. CFO Richard, two observations. One is the high school scheduling and staffing. Can you take an action to talk with the OTM folks and then with school leadership to see if we can leverage like joint appointments across staff to use them effectively that way? There are staff in the district that have more than one certification.
Dual certification, yeah.
So they can be
yeah.
SPED certified and then math certified. A lot of people kind of just work in one of them. And so this seeing if there's a way we can get some flexibility that you were seeking in that box.
Yeah, that's a great idea.
The other one is with the buildings. Currently, the district owns, well, we have ownership, quote unquote, of our buildings while they're being used as schools. And I know Chair Brody and I had some, went to some workshops, conferences where they were talking about creatively using those properties when they're no longer schools. I'm wondering if the city would be open to entertaining that with the idea of earmarking that money for the district's use, as opposed to it kind of just going back to the city and falling into the city's general fund? Does that make sense?
Yeah,
To
no, that does make
propose that?
sense. Yeah. The exploring partnership with the city related to some of our buildings.
If
Because I know the city is working on kind of repurposing buildings for things like housing.
correct. Yeah, that's it.
Yeah, I'm just
Thank
gonna
you. So,
jump in if that's
okay,
okay.
Board Member Mills, you have the floor.
Yeah, so if we close the school, it just goes back to the city. Like that's it. Like the city owns them. We can use them as schools, but the minute they're no longer schools, it reverts back to the city. So that's not to say that your like idea of talking to the city to use them for other things is not a valid one, but like it's like an automatic thing. So just want to clarify that. Like the city wants.
Can I ask? Oops, sorry, I want to add something after Mr. Mills.
Yeah, I mean, that's pretty much it. I just wanted to point out that like we don't really have a say on what happens to those buildings after they are no longer schools unless we work that out.
So if I can add, Madam First Vice, when we deem a school no longer needed for educational use, that's when we deem it that we take a vote to turn it back over to the city. But there's other conversations that could be had around educational use, but that is when we turn it over, when we deem it no need for educational use. And we take an official vote by this body to turn it over to the city.
Thank you, Board Chair Brody. I don't see Board Member Mills. I don't see his hand up anymore. Okay, thank you. And I don't see anyone else's hand up anymore. So thank you so much for the presentation. And is there some more?
There's like 2 more slides and then
Okay.
we will
Okay.
go. Okay, this was helpful though, because this is what we're going to start looking at for the process for next year. Just a few more slides. I did want to bring this back. These are the items the city is specifically funding in the budget for this year. So it was $1 million for full service community schools. So those are our community partners at a subset of our schools that are not covered by various grants that we have. Opportunity Academy as well is funded with city funding, as well as Ready CT and CT Rise. And I know this was part of those contract processes. We know that this is one-time funding, and that's been part of that process, as well as specifically the dental portion of some of our clinics is also supported by the city. So there's not necessarily something to do about this right now, but I did want to put it back on the radar that these are currently specifically funded by the city, and unless something changes, they no longer will be for next year. The last couple slides are about the community engagement process. And so I will say part of this is just having the conversation with people early and often. We're going to be doing a bit of a roadshow to discuss what we just talked about here with our central office, our school leaders, school governance councils, community partners, unions, just so everyone is aware of the big picture of what we're facing, some of the trends, and so we can start to organize some of the advocacy work. Because I think that really is the biggest next step coming out of this is what are we advocating for and who are we mobilizing? One way in which we've started to engage families, and this was part of the superintendent's listening tour as well, is just asking a quick question. And so I mentioned last time we have a tool that allows us to just ask a question through Parent Square, which is how we text parents. Parents can write back, they can type, they can do a voice memo, just to give us a sense of what they're thinking. And so a couple weeks ago, we asked the question, what's one thing the district could do right now to make a clear, positive difference for your family? So we've been looking at some of those results, and I wanted to share some of them here. One, so you have access to them, and two, I'm thinking about it from the lens of, okay, what does this mean for our budget process? What are families saying they need so that we can keep that in mind as we work through it? And so what you'll see here is just there's 2 slides, just some of the high level responses. And then there's, quotes that back this up. But when we asked, what's one thing we could do? We got about 300 responses, some focused on academics and academic support, some focused on school climate, things like discipline and environment where students feel safe. There's a piece on staff relationships. So to make sure that we're adequately staffed and we're supporting our educators. Some was about resource access, which specifically means things like mental health services, after school programs, making sure resources are equitably distributed. Special education, so things around supports for our special education students. And then finally, I thought it was very interesting that this was a free form question, so folks could respond whatever they wanted. And finance actually came up as one of the top 6 categories of what families said. So just financial concerns and potential budget cuts, the impact on resources and staffing levels. And so I think it's just important to recognize our families have been feeling the weight of the structural deficit, of the budget cuts, and they're naming some of the things that are most important for us to focus on. And so I think this will help both with the decisions that we're making in the process, but also just in the advocacy work and making sure that we're advocating for what our families want and what they need, and also organizing our families to be part of that process and helping everyone understand what the biggest levers are that we could pull to create a better reality. So just wanted to share some of that, and we're reading through the responses. We're seeing some more of the specifics of what people said and making sure the right teams get the information to respond to them. But I definitely wanted to bring this here as just something we want to be doing throughout this process is lower stakes ways for people to engage and tell us what's important. And yeah, just found it powerful that families were naming our finances and budget as one of the main things they're thinking about. All right, I'm officially done with my content, and I think we can open it up one last time for just any last comments or thoughts.
Thank you so much, Caitlin. I do have one question. This survey, if you will, did this come, when exactly was this posted? Was this shared?
It was shared, so it was shared via Parent Square, and we're trying kind of a new method of doing it. So it would be like a text that parents got, and I believe it was, I'm trying to find the exact date that we sent it out. The week of the 27th, I believe, of October, so about 2 weeks ago. I can find the exact date later. But we sent it out on a Thursday to families just as a text in Parent Square, and it basically has a link, and then they can just type or do a voice memo there, and it does the translation aspect of it as well.
Okay, thank you. And what was so far, like, are you able to see what schools or what zones, if you will, had the highest responses and what those responses were?
So not yet, and that's something we've talked about. For now, we just did it. It's completely anonymous because we wanted people to feel safe to share whatever they were thinking. But I think moving forward, we are thinking about, because this was kind of a first test of let's ask a question, see who responds and with what. But I think as we move forward with it, there are ways where we could target it. And so we could see where are people responding from, and then even say, okay, if this zone is talking about X, Y, and Z, we could target a follow-up question just to that zone. So I'd say more to come on that, but this one was just fully anonymous.
Yes, thank you. Because I'm thinking one zone perhaps could be focused on, security, safety. Another zone could be focused more on perhaps their priority may be academics, because that safe feeling is already exists. So.
Yes.
And then,
yes.
and once you get that data, how will you plan, to improve?
Yep. And I think you're totally right. It could be different. And so I think part of this is going to be us at the district level. So what we're going to do with this data is we're sending it to the teams responsible for each area. So any response about transportation, for example, is going to go to the transportation team, as well as our senior leadership team is looking at it. But I think there's potential for this to be used at the school level as well, to your point of if a particular school can look at their particular data, or even if they're the ones sending out a question just to their families that they can then figure out at the school level kind of what some of the responses there, what they might want to know. And I think that it'd be interesting to incorporate that into the school level budgeting processes to say, hey, we heard from our families, this is the thing they care about the most. So I think there's a lot of directions in which this could go.
Right. Thank you so much. And I see Board Member Fortune, your hand is up. You're on mute.
Thank you. So I know I asked earlier about more like long-term legislative action. And even if we're successful and the legislature does act, likely, unlikely, more likely it'll be unsuccessful that this addresses our next year's budget. As we start preparing to go back into this budget season, you know, I don't need an answer today, but I think we need to really start thinking, how do we want to engage with city council and other folks with respect to this expected $35 billion shortfall, which I suppose may be more, maybe less when you fine tune the numbers. But I think that is something that, as someone who will be going into this the second time around, I think as a board, at least speaking for myself, I think I've gotten a little bit smarter about it. And I think there's some lesson learned from last time that we should definitely proactively apply to this time. So that way we are hopefully more successful at securing more funds, even if it's more one-time funds like we did last time, because again, this may take time. And I think we need to start thinking about both strategies, just a short-term impact, how do we buffer it, and then also a long-term legislative solution to the structural issues.
Yes, I totally agree. And I feel similarly. The December Board Finance Committee meeting will be my 1-year anniversary. And so I also have a lot of reflections and from working with you all about what we can do differently this year. And I think maybe at the December Board Finance Committee meeting, because we will have had that first legislative advocacy meeting, we can talk more explicitly about that and maybe do some stakeholder mapping and kind of, you know, what are all the different audiences we want to reach? What's the conversation? Who do we want to be in it? So I think that that's something we can definitely start to get more precise about, because I totally agree.
That
Yeah.
concludes my comments. I'll lower my hand.
Oh, okay. All right. And I don't see any more hands up. So thank you so much for that presentation. And I believe our meeting, and this, you are all set? I want to just make sure.
Yes, I am all set.
Okay, great. Okay, thank you. So this concludes our Finance Committee meeting. Everyone have a wonderful evening. Oh, well, before we end, if anyone has any more questions that you may come up with, please reach out to Christina Santiago with your questions so that they can be answered. Having said